Many people have never heard of the term moral injury. Where does it come from, and how did it become a frame for your work? Why does it matter to you, and why should it matter to us?
The concept of moral injury matters to me because I grew up in a military family, and my father was both a POW in World War II and served 2 terms in Vietnam. And in between those times of war, I grew up with him, and he was a good father. And then he went off to Vietnam, and he came home so changed I hardly recognized him. And it was really hard on our family to have to deal with somebody we hardly recognized who was cold and angry and controlling. So partly for me, I don't want any other family to have to go through what my family went through, and I feel like had I known what moral injury was, I would have been a lot more patient with my father and tried to understand what he was going through. So moral injury in some sense is the collapse of your moral meaning system and your moral foundations because of things that you've experienced. And it's not a new concept. It's in, I would say, most of sacred literature. It's certainly in the Bible a lot. It's in the Bhagavad Gita. I think the entire book is a book about moral injury. It's a warrior reflecting on the meaning of war. So it's not a new thing, but it didn't have a name. People called it shell shock or even stress, or they thought it was a weakness of character, that you couldn't buck up and just do it or whatever. Certainly Jonathan Shea saw it in Homer, in Achilles, and he wrote a book, Achilles in Vietnam, because he saw it in Homer. And he's the person that actually first coined the term in relation to his work with Vietnam veterans. And more recently, the clinicians at the Veterans Affairs Department have decided that maybe it needs to be more carefully distinguished from PTSD, because PTSD has a symptom profile and moral injury doesn't fit it very well. Moral injury is not so much fear-based, it's more like guilt or shame or grief or a kind of outrage because you thought your leadership was poor or your government sent you to a war that you thought was an immoral war, or there's a very high incidence of suicide for veterans who've come back who've killed in combat. So even if you did the right thing and you followed orders and people celebrated you because you saved the lives of your company, because you killed, you may 10 years out start to not feel very good about it.
You cited the 51st Psalm as one that has been meaningful to combat veterans struggling with moral injury. Why this psalm?
This psalm was a psalm that my friend and colleague Herman Kaiser Jr. used as a military chaplain in the battlefields of Vietnam with troops who came to him who were struggling with their participation in the war, struggling with their sense of violating moral values, and he would have them read it aloud because it has an interesting structure and flow to it. It begins with this sense of being an abject sinner, of being unacceptable in the presence of God, of deserving of nothing but punishment, and this sense of self-judgment, that you judge this about yourself for your sins, for things you have done that violate your core moral values. And then it's an interesting turn the psalm takes where it says, give me a ritual, give me some process for trying to be cleansed. So the use of hyssop and the sort of references in the psalm have to do with rituals of cleansing. Don't just tell me I'm okay, don't tell me these things, but actually the whole person is involved in a ritual. And so it pleads for a ritual that will take them through a process that will purify them so that they can be, again, in some way acceptable to God. And then it concludes with a sense that Yes, God will not totally reject me. God will that God will not despise me. So it actually has a kind of narrative arc of the process of moral injury, that you're silenced by your shame, you're silenced by the terrible things that you've experienced or had to do, and you need a community that will help you process that, help you grieve the terrible losses you've been through, help you find ways to make amends and to restore your spirit. And that is the job of religious communities, is to provide those kind of rituals for people. And this psalm, I think, just sort of captures all of that, so that at the end, the psalm, the person does feel God has welcomed them back. And that, in some ways, is also the role of the community, to function in theological terms as that divine spirit embodied in the world and in our communities, to perform those things so that the person feels acceptable to God and to us.